ALS is a multidimensional disease, but what we think is that about 10% of it is genetic. 90% is idiopathic or sporadic. That means we don't know why it happens. But for roughly 10 to 12% of people, we think it's related because they have a particular gene. Two things happened with Ice Bucket Challenge. Funding rolled in and technology got better and smarter and cheaper. And so while there was a steady increase in the number of genes identified for ALS, Ice Bucket Challenge funding and the technology coming together just increased that number. And this is why we have 40 genes linked to ALS today. Our funding to development of gene therapy against this particular gene mutation called SOD1 or SOD1 resulted in a drug that was developed by Biogen and Ionis that is now called tofersen or Qalsody. And I'm happy to report that that drug was approved by the FDA last year. So we now have the very first gene therapy for ALS in our space.
I've been on that drug for a little over 4 years now, and 6.5 years now since I've been diagnosed. That puts me in 20% of people with ALS who live longer than 5 years since their diagnosis. So I consider myself incredibly blessed, one, to have had the opportunity to take a genetic test that identified a mutation that then led to a treatment that I believe is helping me live with the disease.
It's also really important to understand that genetic therapies are not just for genetic ALS. I talked about ALS being two types, 10% roughly being genetic, 90% roughly being sporadic or idiopathic, as in we don't know why it happens. And I talked about gene therapy in the context of genetic ALS. But we can use gene therapy to go after sporadic ALS because we know that there are certain proteins that are involved in 90% of ALS. And if we can go after those proteins using gene therapy approaches, we can now go and treat all ALS and not just a particular genetic subtype. And that's the future of gene therapy. How can we use gene therapy to go after the sporadic forms of ALS?